Realize how convenient and borderline contradictory the categorization on Prime Minister was. It was that people are not going to protest against the creation of this panel. Don't run that argument. But that at the same time, people are not educated on deforestation and they stay complacent even when they see the environment being burnt down right in front of them. Judge, let's bring you out of debate land and back into the real world. When people in developing countries see how the air in cities like Jakarta or like New Delhi have become so polluted, when the majority of underprivileged people, who, by the way, make up a very large voting bloc that politicians have to care about if they want to get re-elected, literally live in slums and currently barely have access to clean water, of course they start to care about the environment. It is unfair and disingenuous of proposition to say that in the status quo, this is not already a voting issue or even an issue that exists within geopolitics. I think that kicks off the 1 minute long argument regarding awareness. With that said, there are two more points of rebuttal I want to make before my arguments. The rest of it will be integrated. First of all, on their framing, they say that this is only about which side gets better environmental policy. No, read the motion again. This House would motion, which means that we are specifically acting as a state. So, if they want to exclusively use that metric, they have to first explain to us when the only role of the state or the primary obligation of the state is to just make environmental policies and that everything else can be deprioritized in the process. Second of all, they overuse their fiat. If they read the motion well, it specifically says that the panel is in charge of policy decisions, not the implementation of these policies, not on the executive level, but on the legislative level. That's the thing though. In a lot of countries, you will already see policies existing. For example, like having to apply for a license before getting to cut down trees, or environmental standards for companies on crucial issues like waste management. In the status quo, even with the existence of these policies, companies still lobby their way out of it. That suggests that everything they say about companies being bad is symmetrical on proposition, insofar as they have not proven otherwise in their speech. They don't just get to fiat this out. Even then, I'll still be charitable and engage to that case in my arguments. With that said, there are two main themes of argumentation that I want to contribute to our path to victory. First of all, that absent of this panel, good environmental policies can still be made. And second of all, that all environmental policies or decisions regarding that should inherently be made on a democratic basis. And that is why the proposition model is grossly unjustified in every instance in which this debate takes place. First argument then, why are good policies still going to be made even without the panel? There are three reasons for this. First of all, that as I illustrated to you in my opening, the vast majority of people already realize that climate change is an urgent issue. It is something that tangibly affects people's quality of life on the ground. Given that, it's likely that politicians will be making policies at a faster rate at this point. Second of all, there exists international pressure. So, for example, there are targets like the Paris Agreement, like the COP27, like the Kyoto Protocol. And we understand that in the status quo, developing countries especially don't necessarily meet these targets. But that is a good incentive for developed countries and for international institutions to actually provide aid to them. That is far better than the prop policy, for the reason that the burden is now on global institutions, on developed countries to help you out. On the comparative, local governments who have very limited capacity in developing countries now have an increased burden on proposition to deal with the issue of the environment themselves and to use their own capital for these policies. Lastly, then, on this argument, how do we deal with corporations and their lobby? We think that there is currently a growing capacity for the environmentalist movement, for example, to hire investigative journalists because they currently realize that companies are the culprit behind the issue. So there's an increasing accountability placed on companies in the first place. And there's also more pressure on the government to actually not accept these lobbies. Even though that isn't true, we proved that this is symmetrical on proposition anyway. Second argument, then. This is the argument that is going to win us this debate. The premise of this argument is that environmental policies are inherently political decisions and therefore should be made on a democratic basis. That is the case for two unique reasons. First of all, that no matter what the policy, whether it is extreme or not, it is always involving a trade-off in terms of government spending. So, environmental policies, for instance, like subsidies on green alternatives or like building green infrastructure, as they say, uses money that you'd otherwise spend for other matters like poverty alleviation, like for example welfare. So there's an active opportunity cost that you are taking and that governments have to take. And this has dire consequences on people on the ground, in the sense that, for example, less schools are going to be built, less public housing is going to be created because governments obviously don't have an infinite amount of money. So maybe there are other issues that can act as a counterbalance. Maybe governments won't spend every last penny into environmental policy, but those other issues comparatively get less funding on proposition. They cannot have it all. Secondly, this directly influences the trajectory and growth of that country. If you go all out on environmental policies, developing countries are robbed of the same opportunity that developed countries once had, that is to use things like, for example, fossil fuel or coal that are extremely efficient energy resources that can help improve their country. The burden then on developing countries to have this is just incredibly unjust because they don't get the same opportunities that developed countries once had. This means that, inherently, all environmental policies sacrifice short term benefits, like short term growth of the nation, for example, for the sake of the long run. So, no matter the policy, the most important thing then, given this characterization, is to give people a choice to vote on which problem is the most urgent for them and the most impactful for them. If climate change is that most urgent problem, then obviously that's where we place more funding. But if the more urgent problem in that country is healthcare, then that is where the more funding goes. It is context dependent and based on the will of the people. And as proposition suggests, right, you can only get representation when you have politicians being the one deciding and debating different ideologies to decide which policy is good. Different ideologies might not necessarily be a bad thing on an opposition. And here, the way that PM tried to preempt this was to say that this panel is still made out of people too, so it's perfectly fine. No, when these people are not democratically elected, and therefore they cannot represent the people in that sense, and they cannot represent the people in the government. That's why you cannot make this trade-off without the people. That is to say that you're going to be a paternalistic government if you choose and you make decisions on behalf of the people. Why then should you weigh this argument over proposition, and why then do we win the first figure exchange? On two levels. First of all, this second argument assumes that they get the best and the most thorough environmental policies. We say that if those policies are not made democratically, and if those policies are not representative, we still don't want these policies to begin with. So, if you believe nothing of the first half of my speech, which tells you, well, you still get good policy under outside of the House, this still wins us the first speaker exchange, because it is still the obligation that the state has to represent the people's interests either way, and environmental policies might be one of those things where you have to decide and you have to take trade-offs, right? That was the burden that both sides had to take on to ensure that this is within the state interest. Second of all, this argument has a far larger impact in more vulnerable areas, like, for example, developing countries. That is to say that these countries are the ones who, for example, have very limited resources or who desperately need funding to go to a lot of other sectors to increase, for example, the quality of public services that many people actually actively depend on and actually actively need on their outside of the house. Therefore, given that, policy should all be made democratically, and you cannot just make it on behalf of the people. That is something that is very autocratic in nature, and that is something that makes you a paternalistic government. We don't want that in our opposition under any circumstance, and no matter how much tangible benefits it gives you, if it is not something that is based on democracy, we don't want it. Even in our worst case, where we don't get perfect policy, and we can concede that, it is still policy that the people want and need the most. For that reason, oppose.